My son's bride called me low class. My son just sat there and let her humiliate me. Little did he know what I was about to do. I calmly approached the stage. His jaw dropped. Before we continue, I just want to say thank you for taking the time to hear my story. If you're comfortable, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. Now let me tell you my story. My life, as I entered my 60th year, had settled into a rhythm of quiet, earned satisfaction. My world was one of textures and scents, of the heft of a well-made copper pot and the earthy aroma of fresh thyme from my garden. I was a retired chef, a restaurateur, a woman whose name was etched in the culinary history of the city. But the empire I had built, a nationally recognized group of farm-to-table restaurants, was a thing I had put behind me. I had sold the final flagship location a year ago, trading the relentless heat of the kitchen for the gentle warmth of my greenhouse. My name is Deborah James, and I am a self-made woman. That is not a boast, it is a simple geological fact, like a seam of granite running through a mountain. I had started with a small 20-seat cafe, a place my late husband Robert had helped me build with his own 2 hands. He had been the dreamer, the warm, smiling face at the front of the house. I had been the engine in the back, a whirlwind of knives and fire and a relentless, uncompromising pursuit of flavor. From that single humble cafe, an empire had grown, but I had never let the empire change me. My wealth, which was substantial, was a private matter, a quiet source of security and freedom, not a costume to be worn for the world. I still lived in the comfortable, unpretentious brick home Robert and I had bought 30 years ago, a house filled with the comfortable ghosts of a happy marriage and a well-loved child. My style, a source of constant, gentle frustration for my daughter-in-law-to-be, Amara, was one of quiet luxury. I had no interest in the loud, logo-stamped declarations of designer brands that she so revered. I preferred the exquisite, anonymous feel of a hand-woven cashmere shawl from a small Scottish mill, the perfect architectural cut of a dress made for me by a talented, unknown tailor in the city. My luxury was in the craftsmanship, the story of the object, not the marketing budget of the corporation that produced it. This philosophy was, to Amara, a source of profound and constant confusion. She was a woman who lived in a world of surfaces, where your value was written in the labels on your clothes and the brand of your handbag. She was an art consultant, a job that allowed her to move through the glittering world of the very wealthy, a world she was desperately and with a ruthless focus, trying to make her own. My lack of brand obsession was, in her eyes, a tragic and deeply embarrassing character flaw. She had, with the simple brutal logic of the truly insecure, misinterpreted my lack of flash for a lack of funds. She believed I was poor, or at the very least hopelessly and provincially low class. As I stood before my antique full-length mirror preparing for my only son's wedding, a deep maternal pride warred with a familiar weary apprehension. I was proud of Michael. He had grown into a fine man, a successful corporate lawyer, kind and gentle, if somewhat pliable. He had always been a quiet boy, easily swayed by more powerful personalities, and Amara, his fiancée, possessed a personality of immense and almost terrifying power. She was a project, a woman I did not understand, a woman whose values were as foreign to me as a distant, hostile country I had no desire to visit. My dress for the wedding was a testament to my own values. It was a simple, impeccably tailored sheath of deep sapphire blue silk, a color that brought out the warmth in my skin and the silver in my hair. It had been custom-made for me by the same tailor who had been making my clothes for 20 years. The fabric, a heavy, luxurious silk crepe, was a dream against my skin, its quality a quiet, confident whisper, not a shout. It was in its own way a dress that cost more than most cars, but it had no label. It had no glitter, no sequins, no desperate cry for attention. It was simply beautiful, and I knew with a mother's sad and certain intuition that Amara, a woman who spoke in the language of brands and seasons, would absolutely positively hate it. I adjusted the simple, elegant pearl necklace that had been Robert's wedding gift to me. My heart was full of a mother's pride, a deep primal joy at the thought of seeing my only child, my Michael, get married. But beneath it was a cold, hard knot of dread. I knew with a certainty that was as sharp and as painful as a shard of glass, that I was not just a guest at this wedding, I was a test. A final, embarrassing hurdle that my future daughter-in-law had to overcome on her way to her perfect new life. And I had a terrible sinking feeling that it was a test we were all in our own ways about to fail. My first formal introduction to Amara's family had been at a pre-wedding brunch a month before the ceremony, an event Amara had billed as an intimate gathering of the two families. The setting was a private and breathtakingly expensive country club, a place of hushed tones, manicured lawns, and the quiet, confident hum of generational wealth. Amara had described her family to me in hushed, reverent tones in the weeks leading up to the brunch. They were old money, she had said, a family of quiet, philanthropic aristocrats with estates in the country, a family trust that dated back to the Gilded Age, and a lineage that was, she hinted, vaguely European and deeply impressive. They were, when I met them, almost too perfect. They were a caricature, a casting director's dream of an aristocratic family. The patriarch, a man named Bartholomew Vaughan, was tall and impossibly distinguished, with a mane of perfectly coiffed silver hair and a booming, plummy mid-Atlantic accent that sounded like it had been lifted directly from a 1940s film. He wore a tweed jacket despite the warm spring day and spoke with a weary patrician air about his investments in emerging markets and his concerns about the new stables for the polo ponies. The mother, Eleonora, was a pale, elegant and almost completely silent woman who seemed to float through the room in a cloud of beige silk and very expensive, very subtle, perfume. She spoke in a soft, vague whisper, her conversation a gentle, meandering stream of non-sequiturs about her garden club, the difficulty of finding good staff these days, and the supreme importance of a proper, handwritten thank you note. They were flanked by an assortment of equally perfect and equally vague relatives who seemed to materialize as needed. There was a dashing nephew, a young man with a tennis tan and a roguish smile, who was, he explained, a professional racing car driver in Monaco. There was a cousin, a woman with a severe haircut and an air of intellectual superiority, who was a curator at a private modern art gallery in Geneva. They were all incredibly charming, they were all impeccably dressed, and they were all, to my trained and deeply suspicious eye, completely and utterly fake. I am a chef. My life has been spent in the pursuit of authenticity, of realness. I can tell the difference between a farm-fresh, pasture-raised egg and a factory-farmed one, just by the color of the yolk. I can taste the difference between real, churned butter and a chemically engineered margarine, and I can, with an absolute and unshakable certainty, tell the difference between a real person, with all their messy, authentic, and contradictory details, and a performance. And this entire family, this was a performance. A magnificent and deeply, deeply unsettling one. There were subtle, almost imperceptible tells, tiny cracks in the flawless, polished facade. Their anecdotes about their wealthy, globe-trotting lives were too generic, too much like a movie script. They spoke of the estate in the country. But when I asked a simple conversational question about the type of trees that grew there, Bartholomew had faltered, a flicker of pure animal panic in his eyes, before vaguely murmuring something about oaks and other trees. They spoke of their investments but could not name a single specific stock, a single company they were excited about. They lacked the casual, lived-in and often boring details of a real life. And their interactions with each other were all wrong. They were too polite, too formal. They were like a cast of actors who had just met at the first table read, each one carefully delivering their lines, but with no real connection, no shared history in their eyes. There was none of the easy, comfortable and often irritating shorthand of a real family, none of the inside jokes, the half-finished sentences, the subtle non-verbal cues of a lifetime of shared experience. I sat at that beautiful sun-drenched brunch, at a table laden with food that was as beautiful and as tasteless as the company, and a cold, strange and deeply unpleasant feeling began to creep over me. My son was not just marrying into a family that was a little too good to be true. He was marrying into a family that was not true at all. It was a perfectly constructed, beautifully acted, and completely and utterly hollow lie. The feeling of profound, unsettling falsehood from that brunch haunted me for days. It was like an off note in a piece of music, a flavor that was just slightly but fundamentally wrong. I am not a woman given to flights of fancy. My life has been one of practicalities, of tangible things like ingredients and profit margins and balance sheets. But my instincts, honed over a lifetime of assessing the quality and authenticity of everything from a side of beef to a potential business partner, were screaming at me that something was deeply fundamentally amiss. I tried to talk to Michael about it. Gently. Your future in-laws are certainly a very formal family, aren't they? I had said. A quiet, probing question. They're not formal, Mom, he had replied, a little defensively. They're just old money. It's a different world. They're very refined. He had completely and utterly bought the performance. He was in love with Amara and he was in love with the story she had sold him. To question that story would be to question her, and he was not prepared to do that. So I decided to do some quiet, and what I felt was deeply necessary, research. I was not just a concerned mother, I was the primary investor in my son's future. And I needed to do my due diligence on this very strange and very sudden merger. I started with Bartholomew Vaughan. The name itself was so ridiculously theatrically aristocratic that it felt like a clue, a name an actor would choose for a character. I hired a private investigator, a discreet and very expensive man, who had once helped me with a difficult employee issue at one of my restaurants. I gave him the name and the few vague details Amara had provided. The investigator, a quiet, methodical man named Mr. Harris, called me 2 days later. "I have some interesting and somewhat unusual news for you, Mrs. James," he said, his voice a low professional murmur. "The man you are looking for, Bartholomew Vaughan, does not exist. There are no records of him, no birth certificate, no property records, no credit history. He is for all legal and financial purposes a ghost." My blood ran cold. A ghost? However, Mr. Harris continued, "I did run a facial recognition search on the photograph you provided me from the brunch, and I did get a match. A very interesting one. His name is not Bartholomew Vaughan, it is Julian Blackwood, and he is not an investment banker." My heart began to pound a slow, heavy rhythm in my chest. "What is he?" I asked. "He is an actor, Mrs. James," Mr. Harris said. "A character actor, mostly theater, some commercial work. He is, according to my sources, quite well regarded in the local theater community. A bit of a ham, they say, but a true professional. Julian Blackwood." The name was a ghost from a past I had almost forgotten. 20 years ago, when my first cafe, the Humble Sprout, was just a struggling hole-in-the-wall establishment, there had been a regular customer, a handsome, struggling and incredibly charismatic actor named Julian. He would sit at the counter for hours nursing a single free refill cup of coffee and tell me with a grand theatrical flourish of his dreams of becoming a great classical actor, of playing Lyrid, of gracing the stages of London and New York. He was charming, he was talented, and he was always heartbreakingly broke. The memory hit me with the force of a physical blow. Bartholomew Vaughan, the wealthy aristocratic patriarch of the Vaughan family, was Julian Blackwood, the out-of-work actor who had once been unable to afford a second cup of coffee at my humble cafe. My hands were shaking as I made the next call. It was to an old friend, a woman named Carol, who had been a regular at that same cafe, and who was now a successful casting director in the city. "Carol," I said, my voice a low, urgent whisper, "I have a very strange question for you. Do you know an actor named Julian Blackwood?" "Julian? Of course," she said with a warm, knowing laugh. "A true professional, a bit of a ham, but one of the best character actors in the city. He can do any accent, any period. Why, you looking to cast him in something?" "In a way," I said. "I need to know if he, and a few other actors, might have been recently hired for a private event, a long-term role-playing gig." There was a pause, and then a low whistle on Carol's end. "Oh, you mean a social immersive," she said, using the industry jargon. "Happens all the time. Wealthy people hire actors for parties, for business meetings, even to be fake family to impress a new partner or a business associate. There's an agency that specializes in it, the best in the city, the Acme Talent Agency. Julian works with them almost exclusively. Let me guess, he was playing a British lord." The final devastating piece of the puzzle clicked into place. The Acme Talent Agency, Amira's perfect family, her entire aristocratic old money lineage, was a complete and utter professionally produced and very expensive. And my son, my dear sweet and tragically gullible son, was about to marry the woman who was the architect of it all. The knowledge of Amara's deception was a heavy, indigestible stone in my gut. My first and most powerful instinct was to go directly to my son, to lay the evidence on the table. The private investigator's report, the headshot of Julian Blackwood, the name of the talent agency, to expose the lie and save him from the profound and very public humiliation that was to come. But then, I thought of Michael, my kind, gentle, and deeply conflict-averse son. He was in love, or, at the very least, he was in love with the beautiful, glamorous, and very convincing story that Amara had sold him. A story that fulfilled all of his own, unspoken social ambitions. To confront him now with the wedding just a week away, would be to shatter his world, to force him into an impossible and very ugly confrontation with the woman he was about to marry. He would be angry, he would be hurt, but he would also, I knew with a mother's sad and certain, intuition try to find a way to forgive her. He would try to smooth things over, to preserve the peace, to salvage the beautiful perfect future he believed he was about to inherit. He would, in the end, choose the beautiful lie over the ugly truth, because the lie was so much more comfortable. And so I made a different and far more strategic decision. I did not go to my son. I went to the lead actor. I found Julian Blackwood's address through my casting director friend. He lived in a small, slightly shabby but not uncharming apartment in an older bohemian part of the city, a world away from the country estate he had so convincingly and so casually described at the brunch. I knocked on his door on a Tuesday afternoon. When he opened it and saw me standing there, the color drained from his face. The charming, confident, aristocratic mask of Bartholomew Vaughan dissolved in an instant, replaced by the pale, terrified, and deeply, deeply weary face of a struggling character actor named Julian Blackwood, who had just been caught in the lie of his life. "Deborah," he stammered, his voice no longer the plummy, upper-class mid-Atlantic accent of his character, but the simple, flat, and very local accent of his true self. What are you doing here?" "I think you know, Julian," I said, my voice quiet, calm, and utterly, unshakably firm. "May I come in? We have some things to discuss." He led me into his small, cluttered apartment, which smelled of dust, of old books, and of microwave takeout. It was the apartment of a man who lived a life of the mind, a life of characters, not a life of material possessions. He was a man who had been caught, and he knew it. He did not even try to deny it. He confessed everything, the words pouring out of him in a torrent of relieved and deeply shamefaced truth. He told me that Amara, a woman he had met through a mutual acquaintance in the city's small theater scene, had approached him months ago with a proposition. She had told him she was marrying into a very wealthy family, the James family, and that she needed to present an equally impressive family of her own. She had, he said, a profound and almost pathological insecurity about her own very humble background. She was the daughter of a mechanic and a schoolteacher from a small working-class town, and she was terrified that her real family would be a source of shame, a barrier to her social ascent, a fatal flaw in her perfect, new brand. So she had hired him, and through him she had hired the entire Vaughan family from the Acme Talent Agency. She had paid their initial substantial fees with a large amount of money she had borrowed, money I now realized had likely come from my son Michael, under some other false pretext. And then he told me the final and most devastating part of the deal. She had promised them all a huge 5-figure bonus, a final life-changing payment that was to be made after she had successfully married my son and had gained access to the James family fortune. "She believes you are incredibly wealthy, Deborah," he said, his voice a low, miserable whisper. "Fantastically wealthy. She thinks you are a multi-millionaire, but that you hide it, that you're eccentric. She told us that once she was married, once she was in, she would have access to her husband's, and your money. And that is when we would all get our final, and very substantial payment." The full, ugly, and deeply, deeply cynical shape of her plan was laid bare. This was not just a silly social lie, born of a young woman's insecurity. This was a financial strategy. It was a long con, and I and my son were the marks. I stood up, my face a calm, unreadable mask. "Thank you for your honesty, Julian," I said, "and I would advise you and your family to continue your performance, to the very end. Your final payment may depend on it." He stared at me, a look of profound confusion on his face. He had expected me to be furious, to threaten to expose him, to call off the wedding. He did not understand that I had no intention of stopping the wedding. I was going to let the performance play out, right up to its final spectacular and very, very public closing scene. The day of the wedding arrived, a perfect, sun-drenched Saturday in early summer. The venue was the opulent historic ballroom at the city's most prestigious 5-star hotel, a space that Amara had chosen for its old-world elegance and its impressive Instagram-worthy architecture. I arrived at the hotel and was escorted to the bridal suite, a sprawling, multi-room space that was a beehive of controlled, high-strung chaos. Amara was at the center of it all, a vision in a designer gown that was a masterpiece of lace and silk. A dress that I knew with a quiet, burning certainty was currently an unpaid invoice. She was surrounded by a flock of bridesmaids in identical blush-colored dresses, a team of makeup artists and hairdressers, and a wedding planner who was speaking in the low, urgent tones of a battlefield commander into a headset. Amara was not a happy bride. She was a director on the opening night of her most important and most expensive production, and she was terrified of a single unscripted moment that might ruin the entire performance. Her face, beneath a flawless airbrushed mask of makeup, was brittle with anxiety. She was constantly and sharply correcting Michael, who was hovering nervously in the corner of the room, looking exhausted and deeply out of his depth in a world of such high-stakes aesthetic pressure. "Michael, for God's sake, stand up straight. Your posture is terrible. You look like a bellhop. No, don't drink that champagne. It will make your face puffy for the photos." He was not a groom on the happiest day of his life. He was a prop, a handsome but slightly flawed accessory to her grand performance. And she was constantly adjusting him, polishing him, making sure he fit her perfect aesthetic vision of the day. When I walked into the suite, her anxious, critical gaze immediately fell on me. I was dressed in my simple but exquisitely tailored sapphire blue silk sheath. It was a dress of quiet, understated elegance. A dress that was in every way the antithesis of the loud, glittering, label-driven world she so desperately wanted to inhabit. Her face tightened with a barely concealed and deeply familiar shame. "Mom," she said, her voice a tight, strained whisper, her eyes darting nervously to her new aristocratic mother-in-law, the actress playing Eleonora, who was observing the scene with a look of cool patrician amusement. "Is that what you're wearing? I thought we talked about this. I sent you a list of appropriate designers." "This is a custom piece, darling," I said, my voice calm and even, refusing to be drawn into her panic. "A custom piece from who?" she hissed, her voice a low, desperate whisper. "Does it even have a name? Does it have a label?" Before I could answer, her father, the magnificent Julian Blackwood, in his flawless performance as the debonair Bartholomew Vaughan, swept into the room, a vision in a perfectly tailored morning suit, a single perfect white rose in his lapel. "Amara, my dear," he boomed, his plummy, aristocratic accent filling the room and commanding all attention. "You look like a queen, a true Vaughan. Your mother must be so proud." He had seen the tension, the small ugly scene unfolding, and with the practiced skill of a professional actor who knows how to save a scene, he had stepped in to diffuse it to get the play back on track. Amara immediately turned her attention to him, her face melting into a look of adoring, daughterly pride. "Oh, Daddy," she said, her voice full of a genuine if entirely misplaced emotion. "Thank you." I was once again relegated to the role of the embarrassing, low-class and deeply problematic mother-in-law. A small off-note in her perfect, harmonious symphony of lies. Her wedding day jitters were not about love or about commitment. They were about the terror of being exposed, of a single authentic moment shattering the beautiful and entirely fragile illusion she had worked so hard, and had borrowed so much money to create. The reception was a masterpiece of theatricality, a perfect, living embodiment of Amara's fraudulent brand. The ballroom was a sea of white flowers and flickering candlelight, the air thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the low, self-important hum of the city's elite, or at least, the people Amara and Michael wanted to believe were the elite. Amara and Michael sat at the head table, on two gilded throne-like chairs, a perfect, beautiful and utterly fraudulent, royal couple presiding over their kingdom of lies. I was seated at a table in the center of the room, a good vantage point for the drama I knew was to come. I was a quiet, smiling, and deeply underestimated time bomb ticking silently in the heart of the celebration. The toasts began. Amara's father, the magnificent Julian Blackwood, gave a brilliant, moving, and entirely fictional speech about her idyllic childhood at the Vaughan family estate, about her blue-blooded lineage, and about the profound joy of seeing his little princess marry into a family of equal standing and character. It was a performance that brought a tear to many an eye in the room, and a cold, knowing and deeply satisfied smile to my own lips. Then after a few more equally insincere speeches, it was Amara's turn. She stood a vision in her designer gown, her face glowing with a triumphant bridal radiance. She gave a gushing, heartfelt speech about her wonderful new husband, about the joy of finding her soulmate, and about her profound gratitude for her incredibly supportive new family. And then, it happened. The moment of supreme and beautifully self-destructive cruelty. The moment she had been, I am sure, unconsciously, and now very consciously, building towards all day. I had been having a quiet and very pleasant conversation with the waiter who was serving our table. He was a young aspiring chef, his eyes bright with a passion I recognized and respected. We were discussing the subtle and, in my professional opinion, slightly flawed seasoning of the sea bass, a technical, friendly and deeply authentic conversation between two people who loved food. It was a simple human and deeply real moment in the midst of this grand artificial performance. Amara, from her perch on the dais, saw this. She saw her new mother-in-law, the woman who was supposed to be a quiet, cowed and grateful guest, the woman who was the living embodiment of the low-class background she was so desperate to escape, chatting easily and familiarly with a member of the catering staff. She saw in that simple human interaction a threat to her own fragile and newly acquired status. She saw a reflection of her own and my humble origins, and she recoiled from it with a vicious public cruelty. She laughed, a light, tinkling and deeply condescending laugh, a sound designed to draw the attention of the entire room, to make her next words a public pronouncement. "And please," she said, her voice a sweet, musical and utterly venomous chime, "do excuse my new mother-in-law. She just gets along so well with the staff." She looked directly at me, a small, triumphant and deeply cruel smile on her beautiful lying lips. "She's a little low-class, I suppose," she announced to the entire silent ballroom, the words a perfect, polished and utterly devastating arrow aimed directly at my heart. "But her heart is in the right place." The insult, so perfectly delivered, so elegantly phrased, was a masterpiece of public humiliation. It was a joke, a witticism, a light, airy and deeply brutal act of social violence. And it was aimed directly and with a stunning surgical precision at me. She had not just insulted me, she had, in front of my son, in front of her new family, in front of the entire world she was so desperate to impress, just handed me the loaded gun I was going to use to destroy her. The room for a moment fell into a profound and deeply awkward silence. The insult, so public, so personal, so breathtakingly cruel, had landed with the force of a physical blow, and everyone was waiting to see the fallout. Then the laughter. It was not a genuine sound. It was a forced, sycophantic and deeply ugly sound. It came in a too loud, too enthusiastic wave from the table where Amara's family, her cast of hired and very professional actors, were seated. They were performing their role to perfection, supporting the star of the show, laughing on cue at her brilliant, witty and devastatingly cruel joke. Bartholomew let out a booming, theatrical chuckle. Eleonora hid a delicate and entirely false titter behind her hand. A few of the other guests, the ones who were trying to curry favor with the powerful family of the groom, the ones who were just as insecure and as status-obsessed as Amara herself, joined in with a weak, uncertain titter. All eyes in the room, which had been on Amara, now swiveled to me, the punchline of the joke, and then, to my son, Michael, the man who was in this moment the only person in the world who had the power and the profound and sacred duty to defend me, his mother. He just sat there. He sat at the head table next to his beautiful, triumphant and monstrous new bride, his handsome and usually so kind face flushed a deep, humiliated red. He did not look at her, at the woman who had just publicly vivisected his mother. And he did not look at me. He stared, with a profound and utterly cowardly intensity, at the half-empty glass of champagne that sat in front of him, its bubbles rising in a slow, indifferent stream. He raised it to his lips, and took a long, slow and deeply shameful sip. He let her do it. He let her call his own mother low class at their wedding reception in front of 200 people who were ostensibly their closest friends and family. He let the room laugh at me. He did not say a word. He did not offer a flicker of protest. He did not touch his wife's arm. He did not even give her a look of disapproval. He just sat there in his handsome custom-made tuxedo, a silent and utterly completely spinelessly complicit partner in my public humiliation. His silence was not just a lack of action. It was a choice, a profound and devastating choice. He had chosen her. He had chosen her lies, her ambition, her cruelty over his own mother's dignity. He had chosen the beautiful, fragile and utterly fraudulent world she had created, over the real, and now deeply wounded woman who had given him life, who had funded his education, who had made his entire comfortable and now deeply compromised life possible. The betrayal was absolute. It was a wound far deeper, far more personal, than Amara's childish, insecure insult. Amara was a stranger, a con artist, but Michael was my son. And in that moment, in his silent, cowardly, and complete abdication of his role as a son, as a man of character, he had broken my heart in a way I had not thought possible. As the last of the awkward, sycophantic laughter died down, and the band, after a moment of confused hesitation, began to play a soft, inoffensive, and deeply ironic tune. What a wonderful world! A strange and profound and terrifying calm descended upon me. The hurt was a physical blow, a white-hot searing pain in the center of my chest. The humiliation was a fire burning my cheeks, making my skin feel tight and raw. The betrayal from my son was a shard of ice piercing my heart, a cold, deep and final wound, but on my face there was nothing. No tears, no anger, no quiver of my lip. It was as if a switch had been flipped in the complex, emotional switchboard of my brain. All the messy, chaotic and deeply, deeply painful emotions, the maternal love, the hope, the desire for a peaceful, happy day for my son, were suddenly and completely silenced. They were all burned away, cauterized by the white-hot heat of that final and most profound betrayal, leaving behind a profound and almost sublime sense of utter and complete emotional detachment. I was no longer a mother, watching her son make a terrible choice. I was no longer a guest, being humiliated at a party. I was a surgeon, a chef, a CEO. I was a strategist, a general who has just sustained a massive, an unacceptable loss, and is now in the cold, clear and silent aftermath of the battle, planning her devastating and final counterattack. The last vestiges of my maternal hesitation, the part of me that had wanted, even after discovering her lies, to protect my son from the consequences of his own terrible choice of a partner, vanished in that moment. He had made his choice. He had chosen his side. He had chosen to be a part of her lie, a silent partner in her cruelty, and now he would be a silent partner in her public and very, very spectacular downfall. The decision to pull the pin on the grenade I had been holding for a week was no longer a difficult one. It was no longer a choice. It was a necessity. It was a conclusion. It was the only possible and the only just next move in this terrible and deeply, deeply personal game of chess. My son had just sat there, and now I was going to stand up. After the final excruciatingly long toast from the best man, a speech filled with the same kind of bland, generic anecdotes that had characterized the entire soulless event, the band leader, a man who was clearly following a very specific and now deeply, deeply interesting script for the evening, stepped back up to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice a smooth professional purr that cut through the low hum of the resumed, and now very awkward, conversations. "At this time we have one final special toast for the evening. This was a late addition to our program at the request of the bride herself. Please join me in welcoming to the stage the mother of the groom, Mrs. Deborah James." A polite and slightly wary ripple of applause went through the room. The guests who had just witnessed my public humiliation were now being asked to listen to me speak. The air was thick with a tense and deeply morbid curiosity. The collective thought in the room was a palpable thing. Is she going to cry? Is she going to make a scene? Is she going to cause a final spectacular and deeply satisfyingly dramatic family feud? I saw the look of pure unadulterated panicked horror on Amora's and Michael's faces. This was their worst-case scenario. The low-class mother-in-law, wounded and emotional, had just been handed a microphone. Amora had, in a fit of performative magnanimity earlier in the week, insisted that I give a toast, assuming it would be a short, tearful and deeply, deeply boring tribute to her wonderful son. She had clearly assumed that after my public shaming I would be too cowed, too broken to speak. She had not anticipated that I would have the audacity to actually calmly and with a terrifying, serene composure take the stage. I stood up. My movements were calm, unhurried, and deliberate. I placed my napkin on the table. I smoothed down the front of my sapphire blue dress, and I began to walk toward the stage. It was the longest and most powerful walk of my life. The approach was not a walk of shame. It was not the walk of a victim. It was the walk of a queen, a CEO, a master chef, who is about to enter her kitchen and take complete and total control. It was a walk of war. I calmly approached the stage, my posture perfect, my expression serene. I moved with the unhurried grace of a woman who is completely and utterly in control, not just of herself but of the entire silent and now deeply, deeply expectant room. The room was so quiet you could hear the faint nervous clinking of an ice cube in a glass from the back bar. Every eye was on me. They were expecting tears. They were expecting an angry emotional outburst. They were expecting a scene, a messy and deeply satisfyingly dramatic family meltdown, a final delicious piece of gossip to take home from this otherwise forgettable wedding. I reached the small set of stairs that led up to the stage. I ascended them, my steps even and steady, my hand gliding lightly on the polished brass railing. I walked to the center of the stage and took the microphone from the stand. It felt cool, solid and powerful in my hand. It was an instrument of truth, and I was about to play it like a master. I stood for a moment, in the warm bright glow of the spotlight, and I looked out at the sea of faces. I saw the pity, the curiosity, the morbid anticipation, and then, I looked at the head table. I looked at my son, Michael, his handsome face pale with a dawning, terrible and deeply satisfying dread. He was finally, and far too late, beginning to understand that his silence had been a catastrophic miscalculation. I looked at his new wife, Amara, her beautiful face a mask of pure unadulterated panic. She was a con artist whose mark had just inexplicably and very publicly refused to be conned. And I smiled. A small, calm, and completely and utterly terrifyingly serene smile. It was the smile of a chef who is about to serve a dish she knows is perfectly cooked. A dish that will be a revelation, a shock, and a final unforgettable judgment. "Good evening, everyone," I began, and my voice was not the shaky emotional voice of a wounded woman. It was the calm, clear, and deeply resonant voice of a master chef, a restaurateur, a CEO. It was the voice of a woman who has commanded kitchens, who has managed empires, who is not, and has never been a victim. It was a voice that was used to being listened to. "Thank you all for being here tonight," I continued, my voice warm and gracious, a perfect, and perfectly false imitation of a normal, happy mother of the groom. "To celebrate the marriage of my wonderful son Michael and his beautiful new bride, Amara." I turned my warm, gracious smile on the two of them, who were sitting frozen at the head table like two beautiful, terrified deer, caught in the headlights of their own impending doom. I could see the flicker of confused relief in their eyes. This was not the speech they had been dreading. This was a normal, boring mother of the groom speech. The danger, they thought with a pathetic and deeply misplaced sense of hope, had passed. "Amara, darling," I said, my voice a sweet maternal purr that was a masterpiece of insincerity. "I have to say the entire evening has been a testament to your incredible vision. The flowers, the music, the food, everything is just perfect. A true work of art." I then turned my attention to her family, who were seated at a table near the front, their faces a mask of smug, theatrical pride, still basking in the glow of their own flawless performances. "And your family," I said, my voice full of a deep and deeply false admiration, my gaze sweeping over them. "They are truly remarkable. So elegant, so charming, so convincing. I have to say, the performance all day has been absolutely flawless." I let the word performance hang in the air for a beat too long, a small, subtle, and deeply, deeply satisfying twist of the knife. A few of the guests, the more astute ones, the ones who had also perhaps felt the off note of their theatricality, shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They had heard it. The first faint and deeply ominous crack in the beautiful, perfect, and entirely fraudulent facade. I then turned my attention and my smile directly to the father of the bride, the man I knew as Julian Blackwood, the man the rest of the room knew as the distinguished and very wealthy Bartholomew Vaughan. He was sitting at his table, a look of smug paternal pride on his handsome and entirely fraudulent face, a man who was, I was sure, already counting his bonus. "In fact," I said, my voice still a warm, celebratory purr, a tone that was now beginning to sound deeply and thrillingly menacing, "I think your father Amara deserves a special round of applause. His portrayal of a wealthy, aristocratic patriarch has been the most moving, the most convincing, the most utterly, completely believable performance I have seen all year. It's truly award-worthy." I paused, and then, with a calm, sweet, and utterly devastating precision, I delivered the line that would detonate the entire elaborate and very expensive lie. I looked directly at him, and I called him by his real name. "Isn't that right, Julian?" The name, his real name, spoken so calmly, so familiarly, so publicly, hit him with the force of a physical blow. He froze, his wineglass halfway to his lips. The color drained from his face. The charming, confident, aristocratic mask of Bartholomew Vaughan dissolved in an instant, replaced by the pale, terrified, and utterly, completely cornered face of a struggling character actor named Julian Blackwood, who had just been publicly and brutally unmasked. The room, which had been in a state of confused, uncertain silence, now erupted in a wave of shocked, disbelieving gasps. Who was Julian? The question was a palpable, frantic whisper that swept through the ballroom. I, of course, was only too happy to explain. The reveal was not yet complete. "For those of you in the room who don't know him," I continued, my voice now taking on the tone of a friendly, informative, and deeply, deeply amused narrator, sharing a fascinating piece of local history with a group of tourists. Julian Blackwood is one of our city's finest and most versatile character actors. A true gem of the local theater scene. I paused. A small, nostalgic smile on my face. A smile that was, in its own way, the cruelest cut of all. In fact, I've been a fan of his work for years. Ever since he used to wait tables at my first humble little cafe, The Humble Sprout, 20 years ago when he was just a struggling young actor with big dreams. A new and far more satisfying wave of shocked and now deeply scandalized murmurs rippled through the room. A waiter? A cafe? This did not fit the narrative of the polo ponies and the family trust. The lie was not just exposed, it was beginning to look pathetic. And his supporting cast tonight, I said, gesturing with a gracious sweeping motion to the table where Amara's family sat, now frozen in a tableau of pure, unadulterated theatrical horror, their faces a mask of identical panicked shock, has been equally brilliant, a truly wonderful ensemble performance from the very talented and I'm sure, very reasonably priced actors of the Acme Talent Agency. I let the name of the agency, the final irrefutable, and deeply humiliating fact hang in the air. The bomb had been dropped. The beautiful, perfect and entirely fictional Bond family had just been publicly and brutally unmasked. The lie was not just exposed, it had been publicly and brutally dissected, and its sad, cheap and fraudulent component parts had been laid bare for all the world to see. Amara, darling, I said, my voice now a soft, almost pitying murmur, the voice of a mother speaking to a very foolish child who has just made a terrible and very public mistake. I know you were worried about the cost of, well, of everything. This level of theatrical production of hiring such a talented cast of actors does not come cheap. I reached into my small, elegant evening bag and took out a simple, cream-colored and very expensive-looking envelope. So my wedding gift to you and to Michael, I announced, my voice ringing with a false bright generosity that was the perfect final and most brutal echo of Amara's own performative tone. Is this? I walked with a slow, deliberate, and deeply satisfying grace from the stage to the gift table, a table that was laden with expensive and now utterly meaningless presents from the other, unsuspecting guests. I have taken the liberty, I said, my voice a clear, ringing declaration that carried to every corner of the now dead silent room, of paying the final invoices for your entire family. I paused, a final brutal and deeply satisfying twist of the knife, a final perfect echo of Amara's own cruel words. They are, after all, I said, my eyes finding my daughter's which were now wide with a dawning abject and deeply satisfying horror, part of the wedding staff. I placed the envelope which contained not a check for the happy couple, but the paid in full and very substantial invoice from the Acme Talent Agency, on top of the pile of gifts. My wedding gift was not a gift at all, it was a receipt. A receipt for her lies, a final and very public accounting of the true cost of her ambition. The room, which had been a sea of shocked murmuring confusion, was now a dead, profound and utterly breathtakingly silent ocean. The only sound was the faint, high-pitched and deeply satisfying hum of the ballroom's ventilation system. I turned my attention for the last time to my son, Michael, the boy I had raised, the man I had loved, the stranger who had sat in silent, cowardly complicity as his own mother was publicly humiliated. He was staring, not at me, not at the stunned crowd, but at his new wife Amara. His handsome and usually so placid face was a mask of pure uncomprehending and abject horror. His jaw had literally, physically, dropped open. He was finally, and for the very first time, seeing her, not the glamorous, sophisticated old money goddess he had fallen in love with, the woman who was his ticket to a higher, better world, but the desperate, insecure and profoundly, deeply dishonest woman she truly was. He was a man who had just discovered that his entire beautiful and very expensive marriage was a complete and utter fraud. The lie he had so spinelessly, so silently, so completely chosen over his own mother, had just been revealed to be a lie of such epic and such pathetic proportions, that it had shattered his entire and very small world. His jaw was dropped, and his life as he knew it, the beautiful, perfect and entirely fictional life he had been so proud of, was over. I turned to him, to my son, the boy whose scraped knees I had bandaged, whose homework I had helped with, whose dreams I had funded, the man who had just an hour before broken my heart with his silence. Michael, I said, and my voice was no longer the voice of a mother, warm and forgiving, It was the voice of a judge, a CEO, a queen. It was the voice of a woman who was delivering a final and irrevocable verdict on his character. I always wanted you to marry into a family of class, of substance, of character. I looked from his shattered, broken face to Amara's, which was now a crumbling ruin of pure, unadulterated panic, her eyes darting around the room like a trapped animal, searching for an escape that did not exist. It seems, I said, my voice a quiet, and deeply, deeply satisfying and very, very final word, a word that was the final, brutal and perfectly delivered eulogy for their fraudulent marriage, that you will have to settle for a woman who hires it by the hour. I placed the microphone gently back on its stand. The small, soft, metallic sound was the only thing that moved in the dead silent, cavernous ballroom. I looked out, one last time at the sea of shocked and now deeply, deeply respectfully silent faces. I gave a small, polite and utterly, completely and finally dismissive nod. And then I turned, and I walked calmly, and with a profound, and deeply satisfying sense of utter and complete, and final, and absolute, freedom, off the stage, and out of the ballroom, leaving my son, his new bride, and their entire beautiful, fraudulent and now utterly, completely, and spectacularly ruined wedding, to implode in the beautiful, devastating devilace I had created.